Okay, so we've got some research here on a topic that, I gotta say, gets people fired up. Incarceration rates, specifically for sexual offenses, and how those rates look when you break them down by gender identity.
Hmm.
And, obviously there are a lot of opinions out there. This deep dive, though, we're going to really try and just get into the data, just the numbers, see what they actually say, especially looking at England and Wales.
Yeah, sensitive topic for sure. Hard to even talk about without, people getting really opinionated. But that's kind of the point, right? We got to look at the facts.
Exactly. And what's really interesting to me in this deep dive is that we can compare data from like before and after this big change in how gender identity is even counted. The 2021 census in England and Wales.
Yeah.
For the first time, people could self-identify. Gives us like way more accurate population numbers.
Absolutely. Huge for data analysis. Before 2021, it was all estimates for the trans population. And those are, all over the place. So it was really hard to, actually get a clear picture.
Right, totally.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Watch them all drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
So just to kind of give our listeners some context here, there's this whole debate, especially in the UK, about self-ID policies, particularly in prisons. So the idea is basically inmates can be housed according to how they identify their gender identity, not their sex assigned at birth. And obviously, this is controversial, especially, a lot of women's rights groups have been saying this could be really dangerous for female inmates.
Yeah, and that's where groups like Fair Play for Women have come in. They've been, filing all these freedom of information requests, trying to get the data on trans women in prison, their offenses. And what they found, even before the 2021 census, kind of set off alarm bells for them. Like a way higher proportion of these trans women inmates were in for sexual offenses compared to, the overall population.
And this isn't just some conspiracy theory either. Remember back in 2018, the BBC did that whole fact check segment. They actually confirmed that. At the time, something like half the trans women inmates in England and Wales were serving time for sex crimes. Obviously, they were like, hey, data's limited, but still, those numbers, big controversy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It really, threw fuel on the fire of this debate. And that's why, to me, the 2021 census is so important. Finally, we have a better foundation, Instead of just working off these maybe kind of estimates, we see how the numbers actually break down now that we have a more accurate count of the trans population.
Okay, so let's get into it. The actual data. We've got figures from 2017, 2018, so that's pre-census, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we can see what happens in 2021. Can you give us a sense of just the raw numbers? How many people in each category were incarcerated for sexual offenses? So like men, women, and trans women.
Okay, so in 2017-2018, there were roughly 13,332 men in prison in England and Wales for sexual offenses. For women, it was way lower, only about 125. And for trans women, the data at that point was kind of fuzzy, but the estimates were around 60. But, keep in mind not every inmate will disclose gender identity, so it's possible that number's higher.
Right. Off the bat, that's a big difference. But we got to go beyond just the raw numbers, right? We need to look at rates. So out of, let's say, every 100,000 people in each group, how many are locked up for sexual offenses?
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting. So if you take those 2017-2018 numbers and the population estimates from back then, for men, it worked out to about 1 in every 2,212, but for women, crazy low, 1 in every 240,000. And trans women, well, that depended on which population estimate you were using, but it was somewhere between 1 in 1,666 to 1 in 4,166.
Okay, so even back then, even with that less accurate trans population data, the rate for trans women was, depending on the estimate, a bit lower or a bit higher than men, but in both cases, way, way higher than for women.
Yeah.
Big difference right there, wouldn't you say?
Totally. Really shows why we got to look at rates, not just the raw numbers. But things get even more, I guess you could say, interesting when we bring in the 2021 census data.
Okay, yeah, I'm definitely intrigued. What happened to those rates once we had that more solid picture of the trans population? Okay, so we've got this like baseline pre-census data from 2017, 2018, right? But then, boom, 2021 census comes along and gives us a way more accurate count for the trans population in England and Wales. That number, just to throw it out there, was about 48,000 trans women. What happened to those rates, those incarceration rates, once we factored that new data in?
Well, the actual number of trans women in prison for sexual offenses actually went up in 2021 to 92. And get this, at the same time, the numbers for both men and women in prison for those types of offenses, they went down. Probably because of COVID, messing with the court system.
Whoa, hold on. So less people overall in prison, but the number for trans women went up. That's not what I expected at all. What do those 2021 numbers look like when we, calculate those rates per 100,000 people?
Here's where it gets pretty stark. Okay, so men, the rate in 2021 was about 1 in every 2,530. For women, still super low, around 1 in every 295,000. But for trans women, that rate jumped to 1 in 522.
Wait, I just want to make sure I'm getting this right. That means based on this 2021 data, a trans woman was actually more likely to be incarcerated for a sexual offense than a man.
Yeah, about 5 times more likely, in fact. And compared to women, it's 566 times more likely.
Wow, okay. That is a huge, huge difference. And that throws a whole other wrench into this whole self-ID debate, doesn't it? What are the implications here, especially thinking about those self-ID policies we were talking about?
It brings up some really tough questions, right? On the one hand, you've got the argument that, trans women, they have a right to be housed according to their gender identity. And that saying, no, you can't is, discriminatory, harmful.
Right. And people who support self-ID, they often talk about underreporting in the data. Maybe some trans women, especially if they haven't medically transitioned, they might not want to say they're trans because of stigma or, worried about being discriminated against. So maybe the real number of trans women in general and in prison is higher. And that's messing with the rates,
That's definitely a possibility. And we also got to consider potential over-reporting, right? Maybe some people might falsely claim to be trans to, I don't know, get access to certain things in prison or, try to game the system. It's really hard to say how many of these factors are actually affecting the data.
But on the flip side, you've got those concerns from the women's rights groups. And those can't just be ignored either. If this data is showing a real, genuinely higher risk of sexual offending among trans women, then putting them in female prisons, especially if they have that kind of history, that could put women at risk, right? Women who statistically are much, much less likely to be a danger.
It's such a difficult balance to strike. How do you come up with policies that, both respect trans people, their rights, their dignity, and also make sure that everyone in prison is safe? It's tricky, man. There's not going to be a perfect answer that works for every single situation.
Yeah, it feels like we're walking a tightrope here trying to talk about this.
Yeah.
So, policy-wise, what are some of the ideas out there for how to approach this?
Well, some people are saying, forget about labels, do a case-by-case risk assessment for every inmate. So you look at their history, the crime they committed, any, red flags, and you make the decision based on that, not their gender identity.
Yeah, that sounds good in theory, but is that realistic? Can you actually do that in every prison all the time? Wouldn't that take a ton of resources? And I don't know, couldn't that lead to people being biased or just inconsistent in how those assessments are done?
Yeah, that's the tough part, right? You'd need a huge investment in training people, making sure they've got the resources, and then someone to oversee everything, make sure it's all fair, and no one's playing favorites.
And then you've got those who are nope, self-ID is it.
Yeah.
That's the main factor, no question.
Yeah.
And their argument is basically forcing trans people to be housed based on their assigned sex at birth.
Yeah.
That's violating their human rights. And it can make things worse for them in prison, more trauma, more victimization, all that.
And that's a valid concern for sure. We know trans people, especially in prison, they're already way more likely to be, victims of violence or abuse. And if you're not letting them be housed according to their gender identity, yeah, that's going to make it worse.
So it's strong arguments on both sides. How do you even begin to, untangle all this? What's the path forward here?
I think the first thing, honestly, is to remember that this isn't just about numbers on a page. We're talking about people's lives here and like what we do, what choices we make as a society that has a real impact on their safety, their well-being, their dignity, you know?
100%. It's so easy to get lost in the, like, the theoretical debate, but at the end of the day, these are real people whose lives are being affected by these policies. The people in prison, the people who work there, everyone.
Exactly. And I think the other big thing here is we need more research. Like, we really don't know enough about what causes people to commit sexual offenses, no matter their gender identity. Until we figure that out, it's really hard to make good policies, policies that are based on evidence, not just like guesses.
You've mentioned needing more research a few times.
Yeah.
Like, specifically, what do we need to be studying? What don't we know?
Well, we need more data on trans people's experiences in the whole criminal justice system. Like, how do they get treated by cops, by the courts, by prison staff? What are their needs? What makes them vulnerable? How are their experiences different from, people who aren't trans?
Like, we got to go beyond the numbers and really hear their stories.
Yeah, you got to figure out the why. And for that, you got to do more than just stats. You got to talk to people, do interviews, really dig into the social and cultural stuff that shakes people's lives,
So it's not just about gender identity. It's about everything else, too, right? Like social stuff, economic stuff, all of it.
Yep, it's all connected.
It's about the whole person, not just, like, checking a box.
Exactly. And that's where we need to be, moving the conversation towards that. This has been a really eye-opening conversation. I mean, there's so much to think about here, and I really appreciate you taking the time to break all of this down for us. So as we kind of wrap things up here, is there a particular question or thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing for people to consider is this. Imagine you're in charge of making prison policies related to gender identity. What would you focus on? How would you balance the need for safety with the rights of all the inmates? How do you make sure everyone is treated fairly and humanely? It's a really tough question.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely something we all need to think about. It's not just some abstract idea, This stuff has real consequences for people's lives.
Exactly. And it's a conversation that requires us to, really try to understand each other. The more we can do that, the less we judge, and the more we try to understand, the closer we'll be to actually making the world a better place.
Well said. Thanks again for joining us today. This has been a really insightful conversation.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, keep thinking about this stuff. It's a really important conversation, and we need to keep having it. We'll see you next time on our next deep dive.